Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen Bennett, LLG's Executive Director of Policy and Governance, and Dennis Hall, LLG Bulletin Editor.
Hello, everyone.
Now, we can't start the podcast without noting the governance conference, which took place in London last Friday. Thank you to everyone who made it such a great success. What did you make of it, Dennis? I thought the content was just great.
Oh, it was. I had the remote experience and I thought it was on point, covering most of the topical issues of the day, various aspects of AI that you would want to know about, LGR, of course. And Helen, what amazes me is that the three program format that LLG uses ensures that there's something for everyone. And as I say, I was online following this. The online experience, in my view, was very slick.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also, of course, big news is we launched the Association of Monitoring Officers, which is the professional body, of course, for monitoring officers. And it's going to be delivered and headed up by Rachel McCoy as the executive director for the professional body. So we're absolutely delighted about that. I do recognise that in the bulletin last week, a news item was posted for the blog, not the live from conference blog. So we apologise for that. We will be sending an update direct to members today. And that update will have the link to join the Association of Monitoring Officers. It's open to monitoring officers and deputy monitoring officers who are registered with the company.
Yeah, very interesting. I do feel the new launch of the organisation does represent a key turning point for the development of governance excellence, and indeed as a support resource, as was explained on Friday. It clearly will have a new and clear focus through this dedicated body. In a nutshell, Helen, its time has come.
Couldn't agree more. Absolutely. Now then, just before we begin the usual roundup, there's just a brief note I think we ought to cover, Dennis, on the key financial points for our sector because of last Wednesday's budget, as there was a number of announcements, weren't there?
Yes, there were a number of headings, really, and these are just really a snapshot of the headlines. But I picked out some announcements on devolution regions. There'll be a new £13 billion of flexible funding for 7 mayors to invest in skills, business support and infrastructure. That's a key announcement. And an additional £505 million goes to the Welsh Government. Wales will also be the host for 2 AI growth zones, creating more than 8,000 jobs, supported by a £10 million investment in the semiconductor sector. Then there's council tax. There'll be a high-value council tax surcharge for properties worth more than £2 million of £2,500 a year, rising to £7,500 for properties worth more than £5 million. And of course, Helen, this has now become known as the famous mansion tax.
Yeah. Well, I can see that annoying people, but it is what it is. I mean, let's look at SEND. That's the big topic. So special education needs and disabilities. The SEND reform plans will be set out early in the new year. And government has said that future funding implications will be managed within the government's departmental expenditure limits envelope. Interesting. So councils will not be expected to use general funds after the statutory override ends in March 2028, and that's got to be a relief, I think.
Yes.
But back to you now, Dennis. Let's have our walk through the bulletin.
Yes, right. Well, my first item is on the recent publication of the latest COVID report. The UK response to COVID was too little, too late, according to Inquiry Chair Baroness Hallett, in a damning official report on the handling of the pandemic, saying the introduction of a lockdown even a week earlier than happened could have saved more than 20,000 lives. The document also has a stinging criticism of a toxic and chaotic culture inside Boris Johnson's Downing Street, which it said the then Prime Minister actively embraced.
Yeah, the report said it was an environment where the loudest voices held sway and women were sidelined, detailed in more than 750 pages across 2 volumes, in fact. The findings of the second part of the COVID inquiry's hearings on how the government mishandled the pandemic paint a consistent picture of delay, inaction, and an apparent inability to learn lessons. It's quite damning.
Yeah,
and the
indeed.
report details what was already felt to be a known truth, which was that this was a complete failure of governance in an emergency.
So many lessons are here, Helen, not just for government, but for everyone in the public sector. Responding to the UK COVID-19 inquiry report, Councillor Karen Bentley, Senior Vice Chairman of the Local Government Association, said the UK COVID-19 inquiry has laid bare decisions taken during stages of the pandemic and the consequences these had for communities across the country. Councils were on the front line throughout this crisis, supporting vulnerable residents, delivering public health measures and providing stability in the face of uncertainty.
Well, going on, he also said that during the pandemic, local government often had to act decisively. Councils worked tirelessly to protect lives, maintain essential services, and support local businesses and communities. And their efforts demonstrate the vital role of local leadership and local knowledge in times of national emergency. I actually think that's right, Dennis.
Yeah,
And I think local authorities had to do it blindly because data wasn't shared.
yeah.
Um,
We weren't
we
properly connected to the central decision making that was going
Not
on.
at all. I mean, the first a lot of on a lot of occasions, the first councils knew about anything was sort of 4 p.m. on a Friday when something
Yeah.
leaked through the news.
And that's one of the key first lessons, isn't it, as far as our sector is concerned? We need to be involved in the process throughout, top and bottom, left to right of the picture, really.
Absolutely. So Councillor Kevin Bentley also said that the inquiry's findings and Baroness Hallett's recommendations underline the urgent need for reform. Future resilience depends on stronger partnership, as we've said, between central and local government, clearer emergency protocols, and sustained investment in public health and local infrastructure. And he added that the Local Government Association and our member councils provided extensive evidence to the inquiry, which it did, on the challenges faced and the solutions needed. And this evidence makes clear that local government's experience must inform national planning and decision making, and that councils must be empowered with the resources, data, and authority to act swiftly and effectively when emergencies occur.
Exactly. But I'd like to leave our members with this thought. The 750-page report demonstrates what we now know about what went wrong in government. But do we know how to avoid a repeat next time? What have local authorities been doing to improve their corporate planning and resilience capacity? What joint working has there been with government? I wonder.
Yeah, I wonder too, Dennis, because what's the point of the inquiry if systemic changes are not made? And also,
Hmm.
it's disappointing. The news impact of it. People have moved on. They've sort of left it behind.
Yes,
Um, it ought to have a much bigger billing, and it hasn't, in my opinion.
yes, exactly.
Now let's take a turn back to the English Devolution and Community and Power Bill because we've spoken about that a lot in the podcast. And this time, let's look at the government's approach to the committee system. Now, listeners will, of course, remember that former local minister Jim McMahon initially unveiled plans, it was back in June, to abolish the committee system at councils. And I mean, entirely, just get rid of it and replace it with the leader and cabinet system. And that move sparked concern amongst councils that really valued the committee approach for its inclusivity and collective decision making.
Yes. However, Communities Secretary Steve Reid has now tabled an amendment to the bill that would allow certain councils to retain the committee system of governance for up to 10 years, rather than being forced to adopt the leader and cabinet model. It's very interesting. A massive change, this. A change and U-turn, of course, as you say.
Yeah.
Now, the amendment number 153 at Schedule 25 changes Section 9K of the Local Government Act 2000. It sets out circumstances in which a local authority operating a committee system may continue with it, rather than being compelled to switch to a leader and cabinet executive.
Yeah, that's right, Dennis. And as you've said, the amendment effectively creates a 10-year protection window for councils already using the committee system, provided they meet certain conditions. So councils currently using the committee system, so such as smaller district councils or those with strong traditions of collective governance, we'll be able to retain it for a decade.
Yeah.
That's if there's any districts left. But
Yeah, well, yeah, there's that. Helen, I can't get over the fact that this represents a major U-turn from the government's earlier position. They were very stuck on that particular point
mm,
earlier, weren't they? And it would have mandated uniformity across all councils. They seem to think that was the most important thing, uniformity. Now, the move is being seen as a recognition of the value of plurality in governance models, allowing councils to choose structures that best fit their local political culture and community needs.
yeah, and I noted, Dennis, that the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny has argued that community empowerment must be backed by strong scrutiny and accountability,
Hmm.
um, regardless of governance model, which has to be right, doesn't it? So,
It does indeed, yes.
yeah, yeah. Let's move on to our next item. Let's return to children again, a topic we cover a lot. Um, but in this case, let's examine the points highlighted by the Nuffield family briefing on complex situations.
Yes, the multiple intersecting needs of children in complex situations, uh, altogether familiar in light of recent reports, of course, these are currently not being recognised or responded to adequately by children's social care and mental health services, despite children's long histories with them. And this was the conclusion of the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, the NFJO. Now, in a briefing paper entitled Caring for Children in Complex Situations, Five Learning Points and a Case for Change, the Observatory outlined five learning points for leaders in social care, health, youth justice, family justice, police and education services.
Yeah, and the phrase children in complex situations, let's look at that. It's used to describe children who have multiple and intersecting needs, including mental health problems and behavioural, emotional, and educational difficulties. And the NFJO warned that efforts to keep children safe when they've reached this point can include depriving them of their liberty with a focus on managing immediate short term risks rather than providing recovery and opportunities to thrive in the long term.
And going on, they say, but placement options are limited, and if children are deprived of their liberty under the inherent jurisdiction of the High Court, they can be placed in unregulated and often unsuitable secure settings. Between August 2024 and September 2025, the Observatory convened representatives from children and adolescent mental health services, children's social care, regional care cooperatives, NHS England, and the Department for Education to form what they called a peer collaborative.
Yeah. Well, we've been waiting for reform in this sector
Yes.
and it hasn't come. So that I should imagine that's part of this problem. But
Mm,
following this, the peer collaborative did outline the following learning points. I think there's five of them.
yes.
So the first is that children aren't complex. The services and systems are. And that's a brilliant point to make. Um,
Mm.
it said that we regard children and their needs as complex, but the reality is that the services and systems have failed to meet their multiple intersecting needs, and children rarely present with a single problem, but their cases are often managed by single agencies or several agencies working as separate entities. And second, that at crisis points, care is even less effective. As a child's distress increases and a point of crisis is reached, services become less able to respond effectively, and children are less likely to be involved in decisions, listened to, or heard.
It's interesting, Helen. These are very insightful points,
Yeah,
aren't they? Very. And the third one says services struggle to flex. Well, don't we know this? Professionals are often constrained by service pathways, practice, and culture, and this can lead to mechanistic responses that prevent children from accessing the tailored care they really need. Individually, professionals might be working hard to meet a child's needs, but action feels limited, fixed, and stuck because they are constrained by standardized pathways, practices, and protocols. That must be true. And the fourth point is this, that short-term decisions to keep children safe can cause long-term harm. They say a preoccupation with eliminating risk can disconnect children from important relationships and their communities.
yeah. So I mean, the final point, and it's sort of a summing up of
Yeah,
it all,
catch-all really.
really. Yeah, is that the system can make things worse for children, not better.
Yes.
Overwhelmed, stuck, and fragmented systems and services can, in fact, be harmful.
Yeah. Now, making recommendations for change, the peer collaborative called for a clear signal from national leaders that services can and should work in a more integrated way, and space for local leaders to work on and reach agreement on new ways of working. Totally agree with that.
Hmm.
Further, it called for dedicated system integrators, people who are skilled at connecting professionals and organisations, and a national conversation about how risk is held and tolerated. Well, I
Yeah.
say yes to all of that, Helen.
Well, absolutely. And I think, Dennis, that national conversation needs to happen sooner rather than later. Let's look at a bit of case law. I've picked this item up based on the fact it relates to elections. And of course, many of our members are facing elections next year. This is an interesting one. So this is the case of Moore and Puchin, Pope. I'm going to go with
I
Pochin.
think
Uh,
I think it's Pochin,
oh,
Pochin,
okay, interesting.
or
Thank you.
Pochin. It's a difficult
Yeah,
one.
yeah. And a Nor. It's the case citation is in the bulletin. So, did you take a look at it, Dennis?
I did, yes. It's in there. What struck me, as members will be about to see, the complainant in this threw everything at this case in terms of
Mm.
arguments, as we'll see.
So, in summary, Mr. Graham Moore, who stood for the English Constitutional Party, known as the ECP, received just 50 votes at the Runcorn and Helsby by-election in May, which saw Sarah Pachin, I'm not, I'll go with that, voted in for Reform UK. Now, Moore challenged the result of the election in the election court, alleging a fraudulent and or erroneous vote count. So let's take a look at the fraudulent and or erroneous vote count element, Dennis. So there was a statistical, I can never say that word. There was a statistical issue in that the petitioner's votes were allegedly predetermined at exactly 50, which was the same total he received in a 2016 by-election. And it was claimed that the odds of this coincidence were 40,000 to 1. And that the figure of 50 may have been facilitated by votes being clipped into bundles of 50 during the counts. And then that leads us on to the bundling issue, which was that his position at the count, the petitioner and his agents observed far more than 50 votes in circulation. In fact, he estimated them to be around 116 votes. So that's two bundles of 50 plus 16 loose.
Mm. And Helen, there was also a sleight of hand allegation in that the reduction to 50 votes is said to have been achieved through a process likened to, wait for it, a magician's trick. And
Mm.
the chaotic environment around the central tables allegedly prevented counting agents from detecting this manipulation.
And I believe there was a recount issue in that this was not the full recount of individual ballot papers, but a bundle recount, which presumably would have been quite fast if there was just one bundle, but checking only the number of papers per bundle by flicking through the corners.
Mm. Helen, there was also a separate ground of his challenge, Mr. Moore's challenge, that Royal Mail interfered in the by-election by its alleged failure to deliver election communication leaflets of the ECP. He served witness statements from four people who said they had not received an ECP election leaflet through their letterbox from Royal Mail.
Well, let's take a look at the judgment here. So the judge examined each of the four issues raised. So that's what we've described as the statistical issue, the bundling issue, the alleged sleight of hand, and the recount issue. Now, whilst acknowledging that the petitioner genuinely believed he had been deprived of votes, the court held that the evidence presented was largely speculative. The statistical improbability, the court said, of receiving the same number of votes as in 2016 was not in itself proof of fraud. Similarly, the petitioner's visual estimation of votes in the count room was not sufficient to establish that ballots had been wrongly excluded.
Now, on the recount, the court noted that the returning officer had discretion over the process. A bundle recount was consistent with established practice, and there was no legal requirement for a full individual ballot recount unless clear evidence of error was shown. The allegations of sleight of hand were described as conjecture, unsupported by direct proof.
Well, ultimately, the judge concluded that the petitioner had not demonstrated that the count was conducted unlawfully or that the result was affected by fraud, and the petition was therefore dismissed. On the matter of Royal Mail, the High Court held that candidates are not legally entitled to guarantee delivery of campaign leaflets by Royal Mail. Electoral law does require Royal Mail to deliver official election communications, those sent under the free post scheme, but not every leaflet or flyer a candidate produces.
And in any event, Helen, the Divisional Court struck out the claimant's attempt to make Royal Mail a respondent to his petition on the basis that Royal Mail was not a proper respondent in an election petition.
No, that's right, Dennis. It was actually brought against, obviously, the winning candidate and the returning officer. But it's an interesting case, I thought.
It is, and as you said earlier, we don't get too many election petition cases
No.
over the months, and this was an interesting one involving a high-profile election.
Yeah. Now, relevant to elections, of course, but also relevant to local government reorganisation. Let's take a look at the rules, what's happening with the rules pertaining to publicity, Dennis.
Yes, again, not something that comes up that often, and here we are. The government has reminded local authorities set to undergo reorganisation, quote, to adhere to publicity rules, urging them to take particular care around the principles of objectivity and even-handedness and the appropriate use of publicity. Local Government Minister Alison McGovern said she wished to send the reminder in response to concerns and queries about the compliance of some local authority communications, which may appear to be advocating one or other favoured reorganisation proposal.
Yeah, well, McGovern wrote to the following areas: East Sussex and Brighton, Essex, Southend-on-Sea and Thurrock, Hampshire, the Isle of Wight, Portsmouth and Southampton, Norfolk, Suffolk and West Sussex. And she said that councils must have regard to the Code of Recommended Practice for Local Authority Publicity when producing publicity defined as any communication in whatever form addressed to the public at large or a section of the public.
And the code, of course, requires publicity issued by local authorities to adhere to the following 7 principles: lawfulness, cost-effectiveness, objectivity, appropriate use of publicity, have regard to equality and diversity, and be issued with care during periods of heightened sensitivity. That's to say, the periods before elections and referendums. And McGovern wrote, you should take particular care around the principles of objectivity and even-handedness and the appropriate use of publicity.
I recognise that in many areas, she said, there are legitimate debates about the best model for reorganisation, and that feelings may be running high, and the government is not trying to stifle that debate, but it's essential that councils have regard for the code when spending taxpayers' money on communications, and leaders should seek the advice of their monitoring officer on the code, she added.
Well, of course, and monitoring officers have a statutory role in reporting on matters that they believe are likely to be illegal or amount to maladministration. And she also noted that the Secretary of State has powers in Section 4A of the Local Government Act 1986 to direct compliance with some or all of the code, adding, I will be looking to you to ensure that all local government reorganisation communications are issued with proper consideration of compliance with the code.
Yeah. Well, that might be a potential practice note for our new Association of Monitoring Officers to consider.
Indeed.
Yeah. Now, for our final item, this is the concerning news that 3 London councils, Kensington and Chelsea, Westminster, and Hammersmith, Smith and Fulham, have been hit by a major cyber attack, disrupting services and triggering emergency response plans. So the National Crime Agency and the National Cyber Security Centre are investigating, with evidence emerging that some historical data was accessed and copied.
That's right, Helen. These 3 councils have a tri-borough sharing arrangement, which means that they share infrastructure and IT systems, meaning the attack spread across multiple councils simultaneously. The impact included disruption with phone lines, online reporting systems, and other core services being knocked offline. Residents struggled to contact their councils, it was reported.
Well, that's right. And emergency measures, excuse me, meant that the 3 councils shut down their networks as a precaution and did activate emergency plans. Let's take a look at the agencies involved. So the NCA and CSC, as I've said, but also, of course, the Information Commissioner's Office. They're engaged as well. And early reports on the nature of the attack do suggest a coordinated intrusion, possibly ransomware or some form of account takeover fraud.
Yes, and on data compromise, Kensington and Chelsea have confirmed already that some historical data was accessed and copied, while the council still retains the data and there is concern it could be leaked publicly. Authorities are also checking whether the copied files contain residents' personal or financial details.
Hmm. Well, some cyber experts have warned that attackers may exploit publicity around the incident to further target residents, urging caution with suspicious correspondence, of course. All three councils have been issuing out information to their residents and are continuing to do so on the status of the attack as they learn more. But it's concerning, and there's more frequency around this.
Hmm.
On that note, that's it for another edition of the podcast. You can read more on the items discussed today and many more besides by going to bulletin number 41, available on the LLG website now. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too. Goodbye now.